All right. So in this recording, we're going to talk about how to write your full technical report, your full experimental report. And in a previous lesson, we talked about APA style. So here's another example of how the APA style lesson will blend itself with writing your paper. So if you recall from the APA style lesson, this is what a title page should look like. In your header, you're going to put an abbreviated title of 50 characters or fewer on the left side, all capitalized with a page number 1, right? Notice your title page is the first page of the document. That must be there. Now, what I will tell you is when we went over APA style, we did make a distinction in the 7th edition between a student paper versus a professional paper. And what I'm treating this as a professional paper, imagining that you were submitting this manuscript for publication. So in this context, that's why you have the running head, whereas in a student paper, you might not have had the running head that I'm showing you here. You also are going to have your full title. Now, your full title goes above your name, and that is not the abbreviated or abridged title from the running head. It's your full title. Good full titles are about 12 words. 12 words or fewer. And then you're going to put your name or your names if you're working in group. If you're working in groups, then you want to put all the members of your group's names in alphabetical order, as to imply that everyone contributed equally. Otherwise, if the names are not in alphabetical order, the reader would assume that the first author contributed more to this publication than the second author, and then the second author contributed more than the third author, and so forth. So it's very important, if your group members contributed equally, to put your names in alphabetical order. That brings me to your second page. Your second page of a technical report is your abstract. And you may recall that an abstract is a brief summary of the full paper. You'll notice several things. If you use the running head, you keep the same 50 characters there. Now, that will not change unless you select a different first page option. You will have the same running head there. You won't have to manually put it in. The abstract is a level 1 heading, so it's bolded and center aligned. And then the abstract, you'll notice, unlike your typical paragraph structure, the abstract is not indented. So it's flush with the left side of the page. Your abstract should include summaries from your introduction, method, results, and discussion sections of the paper, and it should give the essence of what you did and what you found. In total, abstract should be between 150 to 250 words, and you can tell if the abstract is sufficiently long based on looking at it. Now, if you look at the abstract and it has 150 words, that's likely 2/3 of a page. If it has 250 words, it's likely a full page. So make sure you're within that word count. And then afterwards, you're gonna suggest a minimum of 6 keywords for your article. Again, we're treating this as if you were submitting this to a journal for publication. So you're gonna offer 6 keywords. And you may recall from earlier in the semester, you had to find articles. And when you had to find articles, you had to go to databases and put in keywords. Well, you're telling the reader that you want to highlight these keywords so that if a person puts these keywords in, your article will pop up. So you want a minimum of 6 keywords. Now, there are times when a keyword isn't necessarily a singular word. So let's say I was using the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI. The MMPI is an instrument. And if I was using that instrument, that might be one of my keywords. But if I wrote it out as Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, that still is just one keyword, even though if you counted the words, it's 4, because it's conceptually one instrument, right? So, or the Beck Depression Inventory, if you were measuring depression, Beck Depression Inventory would be a single keyword. And you have to have 6 of them at a minimum for this paper. Now, we talked about the introduction of the paper already. You may recall from earlier in the semester, the introduction is going to have a solid amount of information in it. You're going to have your 3Ds. Now, by the way, this shell was for another class. So this actually should say, because we're not doing individual labs, we're doing one project, it should say 12 to 15 articles, but I'll explain that. So depending on your class, the number of articles will differ, but the sections of the introduction will stay the same. You'll always start with a thesis statement or paragraphs. The purpose of the thesis statements or paragraph are to capture the attention of the reader. So 3 things generally will capture the attention of the reader. If you talk about deaths, dollars, or disabilities, those are your 3Ds, you're going to capture the reader's attention. In your thesis paragraphs, you want to have a sentence that says, the purpose of this research study is to ... Now that ... or ellipsis is whatever your purpose of the study is. And every individual or group is going to have a different purpose, right? Then afterwards, you're going to identify key theories. And your key theories are going to be 1 to 3 key theories on the topic. And then that's when the articles come in as supporting the initial theory, right? So depending on which class we're talking about, it will look differently. But you might have a general theory, you explain that general theory, and then you might have 4 to 5 articles supporting that theory. Then you're going to talk about the gaps in the research, which are referred to as previously unanswered questions. And then you're going to have your null hypothesis and your research hypothesis for each of your research questions. So depending on the class, it might look differently, but in research methods and experimental, I'm asking you to have 3 research questions, and each of them has a null hypothesis. Each of them have an alternative hypothesis or research hypothesis. Shifting to your method section, notice again, we're talking about formatting. The method section is center aligned, bolded, because that's a level 1 heading. A level 2 heading is bold and left aligned, and this is where you subdivide your subsections of the method. So you talk about your design, which is describe what your variables are, what your independent variables are, what your dependent variables are. If you have a correlation, you'll talk about how the variables are being associated with one another. And if you're using any other methodology, you want to explain why you're using the methodology you did as part of the design section. Now, sampling techniques differ, but the most common sampling technique is what's called convenience sampling. And for most research studies, people rely on convenience sampling, which is just a fancy way of saying volunteers who agree to be part of the study for whatever reason, and you don't know the probability of them being selected. So that's convenience sampling. Then you would talk about your participants. Who are your participants? How many participants did you have? What was their mean age, the range age? What was their gender breakdown, their ethnic breakdown, and any other relevant information goes in a participant section. Then you have your instrument section. Notice instrument is a level 2 heading, and it's a level 2 heading because it's a subsection of the method. Well, we're going to further divide our method section based on the instruments. We're going to describe our instruments, right? And a level 3 heading is bold, left align, italicized, and on its own line. That is a change in the APA 7th edition. So you want to have bold, italicized, left align, and you'll notice I give an example. For example, the BEM sex role inventory, which basically measures societal's values of masculinity and femininity and how one fits into given roles. Now, you would describe the instrument. You might say the BEM sex role inventory is a 60-item instrument which measures masculinity, femininity, and androgyny. There are 20 items for each of these subcategories, and then you would talk about the Cronbach's alpha or the reliability. You would say this instrument demonstrates adequate internal consistency, reliability, because it has a Cronbach's alpha of 0.7 and above. So that would be how you describe it. And you might have multiple instruments, and in fact, you do have multiple instruments, depending on your research questions. So if you have another instrument, you put that there. You put all of your instruments there. Now you're also, if you have a demographics questionnaire, you're going to treat a demographics questionnaire the same way you would treat an instrument. So you're going to describe your demographics questionnaire, how many items were on your demographics questionnaire, what the items included, and I'll give you an example. So if after you had 2 instruments, you might have, let me do this. So demographics questionnaire, right? So you might have something that looks like this. It's its own instrument. We treat it as an instrument that says this study included a 7-item questionnaire measuring age, gender, ethnicity, SES, ... right? Now, it wouldn't be bold, but you would tell the reader where that is. And I would also say when you have an instrument, you want to attach it as an appendix. So you're going to say, see Appendix A. If that's your first instrument, your second instrument would be see Appendix B. And if you had a third instrument, which is your demographics questionnaire, see Appendix C, right? And you would do it. Now, if you have more than 3 instruments, you talk about each of the instruments, and then at the end, talk about your demographics questionnaire. Which brings me to your procedures. Now, procedures is sort of like a recipe. You're going to explain to the reader how your data was collected, from designing the study all the way to data analysis. So you're going to say, prior to data collection, an IRB application was submitted and approved by St. Francis College, let's say. Afterwards, our instruments were uploaded onto, if it's SurveyMonkey, you say SurveyMonkey. If it's Google Forms, you say Google Forms. If it's some other data collection platform, you talk about that data collection platform, such as Qualtrics. Then, if you're using research credits, where people have to get research credits, you would say participants were granted research credit for volunteering to be part of the study. No other incentives were involved. Then, after data collection, the results were exported to SPSS and analyzed using SPSS version 25.0. Now, you see how all of that, I'm explaining all of that to the reader, and it might seem like that's not relevant, but it could be relevant. If you had a certain data management platform, each data management platform has different interfaces. Maybe the fact that you used a data management platform, or this particular one, could have altered your results, or the fact that you used an online survey versus a paper-based survey could have altered your results, right? Or the fact that it was for a research credit could have altered your results. So all of these things, you talk about the procedures so that if a person wants to replicate your study, they can, but you're also building a case for limitations in your discussion section that you want to think about. Which brings me to the results section. Now, in the results section, all you're doing is reporting what you found. All you're doing is reporting the results. You're not interpreting the results in this part. You're just stating, what was your research question? In research question 1, I examined whether males and females differed in masculinity mean scores. Using an independent samples t-test, we found that males had significantly higher or greater masculinity mean scores than females. These results support our hypothesis in research question 1. So that's how you would write it. Now, why does it support your hypothesis? How it fits into the past research from your introduction, you don't talk about any of that. All you do is report what you found. And I have a video specifically on how to write up your results section, which gives you boilerplate language or examples, many examples, depending on whatever the test is that you conducted. It has boilerplate language so that you don't have to start from scratch, right? So you want to talk about your research question and hypothesis, what you thought would happen, what you found. You want to report descriptive and inferential statistics. So if you have nominal data or ordinal data, you're oftentimes going to report frequencies and percents. Whereas if you have interval or ratio data, you're going to report means and standard deviation. Those are your common descriptive statistics. And then if you're looking for measures of dispersion or variability, for nominal and ordinal data, you're going to report modes and medians. And interval and ratio data, you're going to report means and standard deviation. Pardon me, I'll scratch that. For variability, you're going to report range versus standard deviation. I wanted to correct that. All right, and the same thing for all three of your research questions, rinse, wash, repeat. So the results section is not a long section. It's actually going to be, if you have three research questions, 3 paragraphs long. It's not a massive section. It's is likely going to come out to be a page, page and a half. Now the discussion. The purpose of the discussion section, now you'll notice that it's bold center line because it's a level 1 heading. It's in one major break in the paper. The purpose of the discussion section is to review your results in light of the past research findings. So that's the first goal. You're going to compare what you found with the previous research you mentioned in your introduction. So in your introduction, you talked about all these different studies. Well, were your results consistent or inconsistent with the literature you mentioned in the introduction? So you're going to bring all that back. So you might say something that looks like this. In research question 1, we found that males had significantly greater masculinity mean scores than females. Our findings are consistent with BEM 1973, who found similar results. However, our results are contraindicated by such and such person. So notice how now you're talking about your results and going back to the intro, and you're saying, well, are my results the same or similar to what we found in the intro? Are my results different from what we found in the intro? And then why? Why do you think it was? So it is especially important to talk to the reader about why you think it's different if you found results that are not consistent. So, for example, if you found that unlike previous studies, there were no significant differences in masculinity mean scores between males and females, that would be shocking because it doesn't support, it's not what your hypothesis was, it's not what past research was, and then you might have to ask yourself, well, why was that the case? Why is it that I didn't find results that are similar to past research findings? And what you might say is, well, how did I collect the data? It is possible that our results are not similar to past research because of how we did data collection. Using an online platform might be different than paper-based surveys. A second difference between my study and previous findings is that we had a smaller sample size. So notice all of a sudden you're telling the reader why your results might not have matched previous findings. If your results are consistent with previous findings, it's less work to do. You don't have to think about, well, what went wrong. So that brings me to the concept of limitations. You also want to talk about limitations in your research. In addition to whether your results are similar or dissimilar and why, all studies have limitations. There's not one study that doesn't have a limitation. If you do a survey, you're relying on self-report. That means that you're relying on people to tell the truth. But we know that with certain topics, people are sensitive and they might not tell the truth because of social desirability. If you did a lab experiment, a very controlled experiment, it might be so artificial that it doesn't generalize out to the population. So it's possible that how you designed your study could have created limitations. who were your participants? So college students might be different than non-college students if another study looked at non-college students. Where you did your study. Participants filling out a survey in the United States, on average, might have different personality variables than people who fill out the survey in a place like Japan, right? Because of individualistic versus collectivistic worldviews. So there's so many things that could be a limitation. And a limitation doesn't mean the study is bad. It just means that maybe the results don't generalize as far as you want them to because of how you did the study. And that brings me to the last thing, which is future research. In every article, you propose new studies. Well, if you feel that your study was limited in some way, offer up new studies. In future research, investigators could examine ... Well, if you didn't like that you did a lab experiment, you might say in future studies, investigators could replicate these findings using field research rather than lab research. In future research, investigators could look at adolescents and emerging adults rather than college students or late adulthood. You could mess around and propose any study you want. Typically, you're going to report a minimum of 3 limitations, and you're going to report a minimum of 3 future research studies. Which brings me to our references. Now, because I added stuff, it got shifted. For the references, you start a new page. Notice that your references also are bold, center aligned because it's a level 1 heading. Your references also have a hanging indent. Now, I did a whole lesson on how to write references in APA style, so that could be a great resource for you as well. But stylistically, to tell you that you alphabetize by the first author's last name, notice that the first reference is X, and the second reference is Y, and the third reference is Z. So going down, you alphabetize by the first author's last name. I also stylistically demonstrated that your references are done using a hanging indent. Now, you may not recall how to do that, but let me demonstrate that now. So if you wanted to do a hanging indent, you go to Format, Paragraph, and then you could go into Special, and then you do Hanging. And when you click Hanging, that will do all the formatting and shifting over for you, right? So that you don't have to manually hit Tab, Enter, and keep manually doing it. It'll just automatically shift the line over on the second line forward. So that would be how you do that. We also talked about tables and figures. Now, tables and figures, they are designed to be pictorial representation of your results. So what's the difference between a table and a figure? Well, a table summarizes your data with numbers. So you'll likely see grids of numbers in a table, whereas figures tend to be pictorial representations. So bar graphs, pie charts, things like that. But what we see is when we format it, we do table. Now I did table X, but you would always start with table 1. And then you would title your table and put your table there. Very important. It is 1 table per page. You never put more than 1 table on a single page. Now, what happens if a table is really long and it goes on to a second page? That's okay. But if it continues to the middle of that second page and then you want to add another table, you have to start a new page for the second table. So that's tables. Now figures, again, we have our figure where we put our picture here, and then we have our figure. Again, I put figure X, but we always start with figure number 1. And then after you put the picture there, you do a figure caption. And the purpose of the figure caption is to describe what that figure is and what it's trying to accomplish. So if you had a bar graph, you might talk about on the x-axis males and females, on the y-axis masculinity scores, and you would have bars for males and females, and you will say in figure 1 we are reporting mean scores for males and females on masculinity, as can be seen in this picture or in this figure. Males had significantly higher masculinity mean scores. Now I'm just making it up, but it would be relevant to whatever your pictures are. Now, remember what I said earlier about the methods section. And in the instruments, you're going to give the reader a copy of all of the instruments. So if we go back up to the method section, you'll notice that I said see Appendix A. Well, if I say see Appendix A, I should have at the end of my document, after the references, after the tables and the figures, an Appendix A. So if I scroll all the way down, I should have an Appendix A. Now I put that instrument there. Now what happens if you have more than one instrument? Well, then you'd have another page that's Appendix B. Similar to tables and figures where it's one table or one figure per page, it's one appendix per page. So if you have multiple instruments, you're going to have each instrument has its own appendix and it starts on a new page for itself. And that in a nutshell is the full lab report from A to Z. What we've done so far in this particular class is we've done intro and method. We have not done the results yet, which we're going to, and we haven't done the discussion. But I'm going to do a deeper dive on the discussion in a separate video. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to stop recording as well so that we can open up for questions. So stop recording.